Hey guys, I just wanted to go through this PowerPoint with you because I feel this is really important to understand fairy tales and kind of the importance of fairy tales. So starting off with oral tradition. Basically, folklore is different beliefs, stories, songs that were passed down by word of mouth. It was passed down orally, mostly because those who valued it were illiterate. They tended to be lower class. They didn't have enough education to know how to write. There were no schools at the time. So unless they had someone to teach them or a private tutor that their family could afford, they basically never learned how to read, never learned how to write. And so the stories would just be memorized and then told to the next generation. And at the time, there weren't very many books. We weren't a very literary-based society. There wasn't a printing press until the Renaissance. So in the Middle Ages, when most of these stories started, if someone wanted a book, they had to write it down by hand. And so people didn't value the oral tradition of that time in order to write it down, because the only people writing things down were scholars who tended to be upper class and rich. The people who made up the fairy tales were spinstresses. Spinstresses were women who basically got jobs making thread. It was one of the very few jobs available to women. And if single women wanted to get a job, that's what they did. The spinstresses would tell these stories in order to pass the time during their long working days. So the intended audience was not children, but other spinstresses. So it'd be other women. A lot of times spinstresses became spinstresses because they were unable to attract a partner. They were unable to find someone to marry them, which was kind of the ideal at the time. So a lot of times they would be bitter and angry that they had been left single. And so a lot of their anger kind of comes through in the stories that they would tell for themselves and for the other women and adult audiences. And so many of the stories encode messages about relationships, about bitter breakups, about evil men, about catching men or keeping men. And that tends to be a major theme. And that's also why so many of the protagonists of fairy tales tend to be female. After the spinstresses would get too old to spin thread, a lot of them would get jobs as nannies to upper class families. And that is when the audience started to change from adults to children. They would tell the stories to children in order to entertain them. Spinning in fairy tales is a major theme as well. And a lot of that you can see carries over from the origin of the tales. You see it in Sleeping Beauty with the spinning wheel, Rumpelstiltskin, where they spin straw into gold. Those are a couple examples. Over time, in the early Renaissance, it was very popular to have raconteurs. Raconteurs are basically street performers who would tell stories for tips on street corners. And hundreds of people would come out to hear them tell their tales. And a lot of them were very popular in the pre-industrial age. And during this time period also, children were seen as miniature adults. And kind of what's meant by that is it wouldn't be uncommon for children to be treated as adults. So by the time you were 7 or 8, you'd be expected to have a job. You'd be working in a field. By the time a girl was 10 or 11, she might be entering into a marriage. And children were expected to grow up very quickly. Childhood is a concept distinct from adulthood really started a lot later, in the Enlightenment, and then really took off in the Romantic era. And the Enlightenment was in like the 1600s, late 1600s to early 1700s, whereas the Romantic era didn't start until the 19th century or the 1800s. John Locke's essay concerning human understanding introduced the idea of blank slates. His essay, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, 3 years later, was the first essay that suggested kids should be educated. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's novel Emile, or On Education, introduced the idea that children are innately good. Until that point, children were seen as evil. That's why they cried all the time, was to get back at their parents, not because they had a problem or they just didn't know what the world was like and were confused. But it was seen that the children were punishing their parents in some way. In William Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, he saw children as kind of supernaturally good, as having special powers, being able to save people, and help people out and perceive things that adults can't. And that had a big influence on how children were viewed. So it's kind of impossible to know exactly what the oral tales were like when they were originally told. Something like Story of Grandmother would be probably the closest, even though it was collected after some of the other folktale collectors that we're reading tales from. It seems to be closest to the original tradition in terms of having an adult audience. But a lot of times the people who collected them did not tell them in the style of the oral tradition for several different reasons. Charles Perrault is the first major person to collect fairy tales. There was one Italian writer before him who collected fairy tales and put out a book of fairy tales. But in Europe, he was the first one to be successful with it, to have kind of like a bestseller. Over 100 years before the Grimm brothers. I'm not sure when 1001 Arabian Nights came out, but there were fairy tales in other parts of the world. But Perrault's the first one to have a successful European fairy tale collection. He dropped out of college at age 15 because he already could pass his law school final exams. He designed Versailles, designed the Louvre, so he's a very smart guy. And he loved fairy tales. He also was known for being a drinker. And a lot of times he would he didn't like hanging out with the aristocrats and the royalty, even though he was born into that society. He thought they were all a bit snooty, and he didn't really like them. What he liked to do was go to bars with poor people and hang out with them, and he heard them tell all these stories. And he thought that they would make a great book. And so he collected some of their tales and rewrote them in ways which would be more appropriate for the upper class audience and for those who were rich, changing the details in order to make them more acceptable and more moralistic in some ways. And he published those under Tales of Mother Goose in 1697. It was also the first use of the term Mother Goose. It contains Cinderella, Little Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Puss in Boots, lots of stories that are famous today. Princess and the Pea, Princess and the Pea's not in there, that's Hans Christian Andersen. But many famous tales. He took the stories that reflected the peasant culture and then rewrote them to appeal to the aristocratic audience. That was the only audience that had the ability to read. that was educated enough. They're the only audience that had money to buy books, which is why he wrote it to them. He tended to tone down a lot of the adult elements, while also shaping how they taught children values that the upper class wanted to instill in children. He added morals to the end of the stories, some of which, such as in Little Red Riding Hood, make a good bit of sense. Others make less sense and seem sometimes contradictory to the story. Many of the readers were upper-class parents who'd heard bits and pieces of the stories from their children. Their children would hear it from the spinstresses and try to tell parts of it to their parents. But it would be like a game of telephone, and the parents wouldn't quite get the whole story. So a lot of them were already curious about these stories. Perrault often added elements in order to appease the upper-class readers. We'll see an example of that when we read Cinderella. Some of his stories could not be rewritten to include virtuous morals. And a lot of times he would leave in the more sexual elements of the story. Even though they'd be toned down, they'd still be in there. The stories in our books that don't include a separate moral, such as Donkey Skin, were actually written as rhyming poems at first, and have been translated into prose. He knew that publicly associating himself with people like raconteurs was seen as unacceptable by the rich. So, in order to keep people from knowing that he had talked to these people and heard the stories from them, he credited the first edition of the book to his son, who was a teenager at the time, and had not written it. The Brothers Grimm is the second, another major collector. They're the ones everyone knows. They were pan-Germanic librarians who sought to create national pride for the Germanic state, and published 7 different editions of their book, Children and Household Tales, starting in 1812. Pan-Germanic basically meant they wanted all German people to be together in one country. Germany was, at different times, I think up to 84 different countries or something like that during their lifetime. They were the librarians for the king of Prussia. And Prussia was one of the biggest of the countries of the different states that made up what became Germany later on. Basically, him being a king in his castle, he had a private library for his kingdom of the king's books. And they had found books of fairy tales from other countries and wondered, why doesn't Germany have any? And so they wanted to create their own. And this is kind of a brief history of the German statehood, which gets into how many different countries there were, how that worked out. So in 1814, 39 different countries formed the German Federation. But that wasn't all of them, and then it wasn't until 1872 that they ended up all forming into one country. Originally, they wanted to show how awesome German culture was, and that German culture had just as great of stories as the other books of fairy tales that they found in the library. But what they ended up doing is, after a while, they decided rather than show German people were awesome, what they do is use the fairy tales to shape the next generation of German children by instilling values in them. The first edition, when they're still trying to show that Germans were brilliant, included everything. It would include background information, jokes, histories of the stories, and multiple versions of the same story. So if 5 people told them one story, they'd have 5 different versions, even if only a few words were different. Later on, they would take the different versions and rewrite them into one version. It's also good to note that whereas Perrault heard the stories from peasants and then tried to write them for the rich people, the Brothers Grimm tried not to change the stories that they heard, but they never heard any of them from peasants, but only from the middle class. Uh,